Hi, guys. First of all, I am so sorry about needing to reschedule from yesterday. Literally 5 minutes before we were supposed to start, my internet went out because it drizzles in Los Angeles, and apparently Spectrum can't handle that. Anyway, thank you for bearing with me and coming back. I am going to share my screen, and like Cecilia said, today we're going to talk about analyzing your newsletter and sort of how to optimize it. So basically, today we're going to talk about how to tell if your newsletter is quote unquote working and what to do if it's not. Up to this point, obviously, if you've seen the previous sessions, hopefully I convinced you in the first session why a newsletter will improve your email marketing strategy and what the difference between a newsletter and email marketing is. Then in the second session, we talked about how to choose a topic and a format and create your newsletter. In the third session, we talked all about how to start growing your audience for it. So today is going to be, once you're sort of up and running, how do you figure out if it's working or not, and how do you improve it as you go? And we're really going to sort of talk about two different pieces. First is kind of analyzing the performance of your newsletter. And then the second half will be some specific tips about how you can optimize and improve that performance. So the first thing is, I want to say that, a newsletter is a long game. So it's going to take time, no matter how great your newsletter may be. It is not an overnight success. It's not like sending a sales email where you send one email and you either get sales or you don't. So go into this with some patience and understanding that you're trying to build something here over time. Don't overreact to your initial results. You send it, you get a few unsubscribes, or you send a few issues and it doesn't feel like it's growing. Don't worry about that. It takes time. So, my newsletter has been very successful. I've also sent it every week for like 5.5 years now. Not that it took 5.5 years to succeed, but where it's at 5 years in is certainly a lot different than where it was 5 months in. So be patient. With that in mind, though, you do want to look for steady progress and improvement, both in terms of results and in terms of your own ability and a sense of what you're doing with it. The newsletter you write, 10 issues in is probably going to be a little different than the one you wrote in the first issue. You will iterate and improve as you go, both in terms of the results and the response you get, and also in terms of your own ability to create it. It most likely should get quicker and easier for you to create as you go. So in those first couple issues, if it takes you a bit of time, don't feel overwhelmed and go, "Oh, I'm never going to be able to do this." Know that as you go, it will get easier and quicker to create. The other thing is, along those lines, I highly recommend that initially you measure quote unquote success based on your output, not your outcome. So what I mean by that is, don't feel like because you're not getting a ton of new subscribers or you're not immediately getting new clients or sales, that doesn't mean that it's not working. Those things are out of your control. What is in your control is, are you publishing it consistently? Are you want to set goals that you can that are 100% in your control. And so one of the ways I recommend doing this, don't be scared by the number 100. I'll explain that in a second, but try what I call the 100x method. And basically what this means is you pick a specific output goal. I'm going to use the number 100, but you could fill that in with whatever you want. So hypothetically, let's say you were like, okay, I'm going to write 100 issues of this thing. And until I get to 100, I'm not even going to judge whether it's successful or not, whether I should quit or not. I'm just going to write 100. And then when I get to 100, I'm going to take a step back and reassess if this is working. And this approach does a lot of different things. The first thing it does is it gets you out of, and by the way, this works for any project, not just newsletter. I highly recommend it. But it gets you out of, you start a newsletter and almost immediately you're trying to decide whether or not you should quit. So with each issue, you're overreacting to, is this working? Is this not working? Am I wasting my time? And so when you set a sort of output goal, you don't have to worry about that, because you're not even gonna think about quitting until you hit that output goal. The second thing it does is it actually, if it ultimately isn't working or isn't a good use of your time, it gives you an out without feeling like a quitter or a failure. So if you set a goal, and forget the 100 number for a second, but if you say, I'm going to write 10 issues, no matter what, I'm not even going to think about whether it's working or not until I finish 10 issues, then you don't have to constantly be trying to assess whether or not you should quit. But also at the end of 10 issues, it allows you to go, you know what, this isn't working. This isn't a good use of my time. I am going to bail on it without feeling like a failure. You can actually feel like you accomplished it. You said you were going to do 10, you did 10, you did an assessment, it's not working, it's time to move on. So, my advice here basically is pick a specific goal, an output goal, and decide that you're just going to hit that output goal, and then you'll assess once you hit that point whether or not you want to continue or what's working or if you want to change it. The other thing about this is it doesn't have to be a number of issues. So using the 100 example, yes, it could be 100 issues. It could be, I'm going to work on the newsletter for 100 days. It also could be, I'm going to spend 100 hours on the newsletter. So you can frame the output however you want, but really it's just about picking a specific output, hitting that goal, and then at that point making decisions if you want to change something or not. The next thing to analyze is when you are sort of analyzing the performance of your newsletter, you want to always remember and focus on your main goal. There's a lot of metrics around newsletters, and we'll talk about those in a second. But really, the most important one is the result you wanted in the first place. You started this newsletter ultimately to do something. You didn't start it to get a high open rate or get a lot of clicks. You probably started it to get sales or leads or grow your audience, whatever that main goal was that you started it for. That's ultimately how you're measuring the success of what you're doing. A successful newsletter isn't successful if it's not accomplishing that goal. If your goal was sales and somehow your newsletter is taken off and you've got 1 million readers and they're all opening it and it's amazing, but no one's buying anything, that's not actually successful, right? You always want to measure it against your main goal. And so again, you need to be clear on that when you start. Is your goal ultimately about getting sales or leads or growing your audience or promoting your cause or whatever that may be? That said, there are a lot of other sort of specific newsletter metrics that are worth paying attention to. But it's important when you think about them to understand what they're actually measuring, because they may not be measuring necessarily what you think, or they may not be as important to you depending on what your goals are. So new subscribers obviously is a metric to pay attention to. It shows the growth. If you're doing this in part to grow your audience, that's worth paying attention to. On the flip side, if your newsletter is really about staying in touch and communicating with your existing audience, then new subscribers is less important of a metric, right? Unsubscribes, we talked about retention and how important that is in the last one. You want to pay attention to that, but you also want to keep in mind you are always going to get unsubscribes. Every time you send an issue, you're going to get unsubscribes. Doesn't mean your newsletter is bad, just means it wasn't for those people. This is especially true in the beginning, because most likely you're starting with a list of people who didn't necessarily subscribe to your newsletter because it didn't exist. So who knows how you got their email. Some of those people are going to be like, oh, I bought a product from you, I don't necessarily want this newsletter. So if you initially you'll probably initially get some more unsubscribes than you will down the road. Don't overreact to that. Open rate. People a lot of times misinterpret, and in case you don't know, open rate is obviously the percentage of people who open your email when you send it to them. Sometimes people misinterpret that as an assessment of the quality of the newsletter or email that they send. But it's actually really only about the subject. It's about two things. It's about the subject line primarily, and it's about what they've gotten from you in the past, right? If every time they get an email from you, they find it very valuable, they're more likely to open the next one regardless of subject line. If you might write a fantastic newsletter, but if it has a bad subject line, it's not going to get opened. It doesn't mean the newsletter is bad. It means the subject line was bad, and vice versa. You might write a terrible newsletter issue with an amazing subject line and it gets lots of opens. It doesn't mean that the newsletter was good. It means that the subject line was good. So open rate matters, but don't read too much into it, and keep in mind what it's actually measuring. Link clicks. If you're sharing links to your content or other people's content within your newsletter, it's definitely worth paying attention to what people click. One thing that I think is counterintuitive here. Well, first of all, it's important to measure that because it gives you a sense of what people are most interested in, which is valuable. But also, I think sometimes, let's say you sent, well, my newsletter, for example, I share links to 5 articles. Uh, I don't care if people click multiple links. I care if they click at least one link that they love. And when I'm actually putting together my newsletter, I have that in mind. So, for example, I might, of the 5 links, I might have one that's a blogging tip, and one that's a newsletter tip, and one that's a productivity tip, and one that's a podcast tip, and one that's a YouTube tip, or something like that. If you don't have a podcast, you're not going to click the podcast tip. That doesn't mean it's not good. That's there for the people that have a podcast. I want everyone in my audience to find one thing that they love, not a bunch of stuff that they kind of like. So when I put the link to the podcast tip, that's specifically for the people in my audience who have a podcast who are going to find that super valuable, right? And then, and then if I have another one to YouTube, that's the people who are using YouTube are going to find that super valuable. So within your audience, especially if you're sharing sort of multiple pieces of content or curating stuff, think about it like that. You want a blend of, stuff that's going to hit sort of different segments of your audience, and you want to mix it up. And again, when you're looking at the link clicks, don't feel bad if the average person is only clicking 1 or 2 links. Like that's fine, right? As long as it's stuff that if they find one thing in your newsletter that they love, they will come back and open it the next time. What content resonates? So resonates doesn't just mean which links are getting the most clicks. It means if people are replying to you, what are they talking about? It means, what do you see people sharing? Oh, when I wrote a newsletter about this, I saw lots of people share it on social media. When I wrote a newsletter about this, I didn't see anybody share it. Oh, this thing I shared last week, I got a bunch of replies from people. Like, you want to look at like what is not triggering people in a bad way, but what is triggering activity and what is resonating, and that can guide you to do more of that stuff. And then monetization, if monetization is a part of what you're doing with the newsletter, either indirectly, clients, leads, that kind of thing, or directly product sales, obviously that's a metric you'd want to pay attention to.